My name is Joseph Blasi, and I'm a lecturer in social studies here at Harvard. It's my pleasure to introduce Senator Russell Long from Louisiana. It may seem to some of you that Senator Long has just arrived at the conference, but he spent the last 2 hours having dinner with a group of men and women who are representing different interests in the area of employee ownership and employee participation. And it was sort of his attempt to participate in a sort of intensive workshop to talk, I might add, in a very open and critical way about some of the ideas and concerns, conflicts and issues that we've been debating and arguing and learning and studying and guessing about today. Senator Long has really been the significant leader in the U.S. Congress in terms of creating legislation on employee ownership. But I think to say that alone is really shortchanging him. As someone who worked for 5 years advising a member of Congress, I know that the truth is that most members of Congress never really think about most things they say. And in the area of employee ownership, we know that that's not the case with Senator Long. This is a person who spends time worrying over the dots and the commas in his bills and in his speeches and in his ideas on employee ownership, and who really conducts his major idea collecting and research on his own. And he did that again this evening with 8 people from this group who are interested in employee participation and co-ops and cooperatives and worker participation and employee ownership and ESOPs and a whole variety of issues. So it's my pleasure to introduce a person who I think has done more in terms of the U.S. Congress to support and enable and gain legitimacy for the idea of worker ownership, and a person whom I believe will do even more to make sure that in this era of the new industrial relations that the old menage a trois that I mentioned, ownership and participation and quality of working life, live together. Senator Russell Long.
Thank you so much, Professor Blasi. Ladies and gentlemen, friends of Harvard and friends of employee ownership, I find myself addressing this audience and thinking about something that happened on a previous occasion. I know in this group there are many people who have been in this field of employee ownership for many years. You've been discussing it all day. And it makes me think of the time I addressed a flood control meeting down at LeCount, Louisiana. They had about 10 speakers on the program. In view of the fact that I was a United States Senator, they saved me for the last to pay deference to my rank. Well, the mayor made a speech about the project. Then the parish officials made speeches about the project. And then the governor's representative made a speech about the project. And then the colonel on the Corps of Engineers made a speech about the project. About 10 speeches, and then they called on me. So I got up and started to talk about the project. About that time, some fellow got up in the back. He said, "Now, you just ought to sit down and shut up." He said, "Everything here has been said before. You hadn't said a word that hadn't been said before." So I had labored forward trying to make that speech as brief as I could, and before I could wind it up, he was back on his feet again and said, "It's like I said before, you ain't said nothing new. Why don't you just shut up?" Well, I managed to conclude the speech in about 3 or 4 more minutes. The mayor was upset about the matter. He followed me outside and said, "Senator, I don't want you to be upset about what happened in there." He said, "That fellow that got up there and shouted at you didn't mean what he said. He said, that man is the town idiot. He didn't mean a word of that. All he was doing is just repeating what the people around him were saying." Well, you here know that this economy of ours is built on competing foundations. We have an economic foundation of free enterprise, and we also have a political foundation of human cooperation. And sometimes it seems that that there are competing values that can't very well be reconciled. But in a political process, there have to be compromises and there have to be trade-offs. And in reaching those compromises, I anticipate that employee ownership will play an increasingly important role. Now, let me just say this for those who are interested in cooperatives or involved with cooperatives. There is no real philosophical difference between a cooperative and an employee-owned corporation. It's just a difference of how they're structured. And I support the role of both in providing opportunities for employees to achieve their goals. If employees' ownership continues to grow, and I believe it will, the end result is going to be a stronger free enterprise system. One of the great challenges of the 1980s is how we can tap the abilities and the skills that will increase during the 1980s beyond the legislative targets. Should they be all? This fundamental question is one of the reasons why the Congress had endorsed incentives for employee stock ownership. A growing number of us in both the House and the Senate now recognize that economic policy should be more than simply a question of how many new jobs we can create. It should include the question of how much and how many in the way of new wealth holders we can create. The Department of Commerce has estimated that in 1982, capital spending by business will be almost $350 billion. Some of those businesses will thrive, some merely survive, and some will fail. But on the whole, the nation's productive capital will continue to expand. If the 1981 Tax Act is to be successful, overall spending on new and replacement capital will increase each year during the 1980s beyond this even beyond this. And economists are predicting that the nation's stock of productive capital may grow by as much as $4 trillion over the next 20 years. Within a healthy and growing economy, there will be opportunities not only to work, but also to own. Government-stimulated growth will create a number of new job opportunities. Those jobs are a factor that will be evaluated and debated in the greatest of detail. But unfortunately, they're not likely to be evaluated at all insofar as the distribution of these new opportunities is concerned. To me, that seems to be a great oversight, and a particularly great oversight for a nation that prides itself in a heritage of free enterprise and and widespread ownership. All of that new capital will be owned by someone. The question of how many working Americans are going to own a direct stake in the trillions of dollars of new capital that these new tax incentives will help to finance. Whose economic growth is this going to be? Whose long-term economic well-being is going to be enhanced? Whose industrial revitalization are we really talking about? It reminds me of the 1960 presidential campaign. Back at that time, Lyndon Johnson was seeking the nomination for president on the Democratic ticket, and Sam Rayburn was supporting him. As you know, John Kennedy got the nomination. And all during the campaign, Sam Rayburn kept telling Lyndon Johnson that under no circumstance should Lyndon Johnson accept the nomination for vice president in the event that it should be offered to him by John Kennedy. Well, after John Kennedy was nominated, the very next morning, Sam Rayburn called Lyndon Johnson and said, "Lyndon, I've got to meet with you." He came to Johnson's room. He said, "If Jack Kennedy asks you to be his running mate for vice president, I think you ought to run with him." Lyndon Johnson said, "Aren't you the same fellow who told me last night that I shouldn't accept the nomination, even if it was offered?" Sam Rayburn said, "Yes, I know, but I'm a much wiser man this morning than I was last night." Well, that story more or less summarizes the outlook for legislation to promote employee ownership. Congress is smarter now than it was a few years ago. More members are beginning to realize that we can get more bang for the buck with these new incentives if those new investments are owned by more than just a handful of people. The Congress has a long history of abundant praise for the many benefits of our system of private capital. But thus far, we have few financial techniques designed to spread these many advantages that it's to offer. If we hope to fully realize those advantages, the system must be designed so that many more Americans will have a stake in it. Now, please understand, I'm in no way suggesting that the federal government should step in and redistribute the wealth of this nation. My father suggested that. I content myself by merely advocating a better distribution of future wealth. In fact, it seems to me that if we want to have a very strong system of privately owned property, we can do it without taking from those who have in order to give to those who have not. The goal I see is that we need not redistribute wealth, but simply redistribute the opportunity to own the wealth that is yet to be created. Whenever the federal government provides incentives for financing new productive capital, the employees should be cut in rather than left out. Now, it may take Uncle Sam to insist that they be put in, because it's been my experience that if there's any way they can be left out, rest assured they will be. Capital ownership is a socially created opportunity. It's an instrument of society, and primarily the institutions of finance that determine who will be the owners of productive capital that has yet to be created. Unfortunately, capital ownership has historically been a social opportunity reserved for a relatively few. That is due to the simple fact that new wealth is largely the function of existing wealth. As currently structured, the majority of financial techniques being used in this country tend to ensure as a class that those already rich continue to get richer. Yet most people cannot afford capital ownership. Most working Americans, in terms of capital ownership, owe rather than own. In terms of productive capital, they accumulate debts rather than wealth. Daily economic survival, not savings and investment, is their main concern. And the less our technologically advanced economy needs their labor, the less they're able to save their way to capital ownership. Inflation, of course, further penalizes what little savings they're able to set aside. Americans born without capital do not have access to the financial logic used by business in borrowing to invest in productive assets that will pay for themselves. They don't have the credit. Instead, they're encouraged to save their way to private capital ownership. Thrift, not credit, is the financial opportunity they're provided. Financing with employee stock ownership plans, or ESOPs, as they're generally called, aims to resolve this financial catch-22. As long as we require personal savings as a condition of capital investment, capital ownership will continue to be an opportunity reserved for a relatively small percentage of our population. The very purpose of corporate finance is to enable business to acquire productive assets before it has saved the funds to pay for them. Leveraged ESOP financing provides an incentive for corporations to make that financial technique work to the advantage of their workers. where debt is financed through an employee stock ownership plan, the tax code permits a tax deduction, not only for the interest, but also for the payments on the principal of that loan. Capital ownership is still attained through savings, through investment in lieu of consumption. Only now the income generated by newly acquired productive capital is saved and applied to repay the debt incurred. This approach to corporate finance has much to recommend it. And I'm happy to report that the ESOP type of financing embraced by people across the is embraced by people across the spectrum. President Reagan, for example, was one of the ESOP's early supporters. In 1974, he drew an analogy between the federal encouragement of ESOPs and federal involvement in the Homestead Acts in the 1960s. Other supporters of employee stock ownership plans have included John D. Rockefeller III, in a similar vein, Fred Harris, a former senator from Oklahoma, as a populist candidate, wrote a book entitled New Populism, and in that book he devoted a chapter to ESOP financing. His title for that chapter was, quote, "If a little capitalism is good, what's wrong with a lot of it?" Treasury Secretary Reagan is likewise a fan of ESOP financing. At his confirmation hearing before the Senate Finance Committee, he explained how Merrill Lynch used employee stock ownership to divest itself of the Lionel Eady Company. The company could have been sold to someone else, but Don Regan, as chairman of Merrill Lynch, favored selling it to the employees, and those employees have prospered as a result of that sale. Republican Senator Mark Hatfield is a supporter. Senator Robert Byrd, the Democratic leader of the Senate, recently expressed his support, and he pointed to employee stock ownerships as one of the hopeful directions for the Democratic Party. Senator Bill Bradley, one of the rising stars of the Democratic Party, has actively supported employee stock ownership, as has Gary Hart, known to many of you as one of the outstanding young men in Congress. Also, Senator Ted Stevens, the Republican whip, and Senator Jack Danforth of Missouri. Another senator, a Republican, but one from whom you're going to hear a great deal. 32 senators have joined me as co-sponsors of the Expanded Ownership Act of 1980, many provisions of which were enacted as a part of the 1981 Act. Those provisions were unanimously approved by the 20 members of the Committee on Finance of the Senate. I asked for a vote on this subject on the Senate floor, and the senators voted for it by a margin of 93-1. Since 1973, we have enacted 15 separate pieces of ESOP-related legislation, and have been signed into law by 4 different presidents, both Democrat and Republican. Some legislatures are beginning to get behind the idea. Delaware, Maryland, Massachusetts, Minnesota, New Jersey, and Ohio now have legislation to favor the idea. Several other states have legislation pending. The bipartisan appeal of employee ownership is understandable. After all, what could be more Republican than the idea of every man a capitalist? And what could be more democratic than cutting the working man in on a piece of the action? Employee ownership still has a long ways to go. A large number of legislators know very little about it. As employee ownership becomes more prevalent and we have more success stories and they find their way to Washington and to state capitals, I have no doubt that we're going to see more interest and more support. It is people such as you who are needed to push this program forward. Legislators need to know that the interest and the support is there. Employee ownership is still rare. 5 years ago, there were several dozen companies. Now there are several thousand companies. But companies with significant employee ownership, where the employees own a substantial percentage of the stock, still continue to be the exception rather than the rule. Consider for a moment, where would we be now if we had started this program 20 years ago? Where are we going to be 20 years from now? A growing number of us in both the House and the Senate have undertaken to correct our economic policy and to see that we create more than just jobs. U.S. economic policy should ensure that we create more owners. If there is to be an expansion of capital ownership in the next 20 years, then this is the opportune time to make this bipartisan desire a reality. And the American labor movement ought to be out there leading the charge. Ownership is the principal area, in my judgment, where the labor movement has not done what it could have done for its members. Just compare, if you will, for a moment, what they did with regard to pensions. These private pension plans got started back in World War II. Back at that time, we had an excess profits tax of 90%. So at that time, companies would put money into retirement plans for their executives to keep Uncle Sam from grabbing up 90% of it with taxes. That led to the kind of situation that occurred down at the Mayflower Hotel one day. 3 lobbyists sat down for a round of drinks at about 5 o'clock in the evening. After a while, one decided he would leave, so he said, "Let me have that check." He said, I'm in a 90% tax bracket. He said, "It won't cost me but 10 cents on the dollar." The other fellow said, "No, let me have it." He said, I have an expense account. It won't cost me anything." The other fellow said, "Hell no, let me have it. I have a cost-plus contract. I'll make a 10% profit." So back in those days, it was easy enough to set these pension plans up and put large amounts of money into it because it cost the corporation practically nothing when taxes were considered. Well, the labor found out about it, and they came in their bargaining session and said, "We want some of that for our workers." And in due course, management had to move over and make room for labor. So now, in these retirement plans, labor has tens of billions of dollars, and many, many billions of dollars set aside for the workers as well as for the executives, and they'll get their share of the pensions. Now, if the workers and through their union officers had been in there negotiating, and when they got through negotiating everything else, they said, "Oh, by the way, there's one more thing. We'd like to talk about a piece of the action. We want some stock for the employees." That is the easiest demand for management to meet, because that doesn't take any money away from cash flow. It doesn't run up the cost of management. It doesn't run up the cost of production. It's not inflationary in any way. That's a demand that's very easy to comply with. And if they just asked for it, they'd have been getting stock all down through the years. They didn't ask. And, of course, the Bible says, "Ask and you shall receive." The backside of that is, don't ask and you won't receive. So they didn't ask and they didn't get. Now, it seems to me that my job has been to try to persuade the union leadership in the country that they ought to be asking for that stock, because goodness knows how much they'd have had if they'd just been asking, especially when it can be financed as favorably as it can with the tax laws that we have today. Sure, those who help to make the economic pie are entitled to a slice of it. But if the leadership of American labor is doing its job, and more is beginning to, they'll also ensure that their members are going to own a piece of the pie-making machinery. Employee ownership has the potential to reshape the American corporation. It can transform the workplace with a sense of commitment and a sense of dignity. You might begin to see more worker representation on the board of directors, and I see nothing wrong with that, such as Douglas Fraser at Chrysler. You might see more worker-owned companies where the workers would be in position to exercise more and more of their own judgment and initiative. You might see a better appreciation between management and labor, one for the other. You might see more workers coming through the ranks to key positions in management. You might even see some of them applying for further education at Harvard Business School. The truly foresighted companies will begin to put responsibility and decision closer to the source of the problem, and they will begin to encourage employees to make more decisions that daily affect their work. In fact, someday I predict you'll even see the workers hiring management rather than the other way around. Surveys over the past 25 years indicate that a major shift in attitude and values is at place in the workforce. We see a growing desire for the intrinsic satisfaction of respect and responsiveness. An increasingly well-educated workforce has brought with it increased expectations. By providing workers with a chance to be more responsive, employees or employers can restore a sense of pride and self-esteem. Workers want and they need an awareness of their importance in the process. That sense of autonomy and individual responsibility can also breed a much-needed climate of goodwill. Worker alienation is one of our social problems, particularly with those just entering the workforce, because it's impossible to measure the cost of an attitude. The real magnitude of the problem is unknown, but it is an attitude that we cannot long afford, either economically or politically. Worker ownership seems to bring with it a spirit of cooperation. It summons a common determination to succeed, and it brings with it a willingness to contribute to the search for solutions. Studies indicate that a sizable advantage in productivity and profitability is often enjoyed in those companies with the foresight to embrace employee ownership. Just as a company with employees will have a productive advantage over a conventionally owned company, so too should the United States enjoy a competitive edge with a national policy of employee ownership. This ownership issue goes to the very heart of just what sort of economic system we intend to have in the United States and what type of system we want to leave for future generations. We ought to see to it that every worker has an opportunity to become a capitalist. For capitalism to have meaning as a workable, enduring system, it must have meaning to the average worker. Just as a carpenter once owned his tool box, the tools in it, and the work shed, today's workers should have a stake in the machines and the enterprise, and they'll take better care of it when they do. As a nation, the American people have benefited from the remarkable labor-saving advances of the past century. But as individuals, most of them have not fared as well, due to the way in which those advances were financed. They continue to find themselves with only their labor as their stock in trade. Thus, each round of new investment tends to threaten their power to earn a living. Instead of being part owners of the capital process, they find themselves forced to fight against it. The situation will become increasingly troublesome as the funds generated by supply-side incentives are used to acquire the best that the new labor-saving technology has to offer. President Reagan illustrated this point some years ago. He told the story of Walter Reuther, former president of the United Automobile Workers, going through an automated plant with a Ford Corporation executive. The Ford executive said jokingly, "Walter, you're going to have a hard time collecting union dues from these new machines." Walter Reuther said, "Yes, but you're going to have even more trouble selling automobiles to those new machines." Both of them let it stop right there. But as Ronald Reagan pointed out, there's a very logical answer to it. The logical answer is that the owners of the machines could buy automobiles. And the more you increase the owners, the more you increase the consumers of the product. In a capital-intensive economy such as ours, The right to earn a living involves more than the right to work, and the right to a just return for that work. True economic opportunity involves the right to economically participate by means consistent with the existing state of technology. How efficient our free enterprise system works in solving our income distribution problem is partly a function of how well our structure of property laws matches the underlying economic realities. If those realities change and our property arrangements do not keep pace, a conflict is inevitable. The expanded ownership approach to finance suggests that what makes sense in the policy of the Homestead Acts, namely to dispose of land in ways that created ownership in new people, should be applied at every step of the government's relationship with its people. Why not use the public sector incentives to build productive capital in a reasonable size holding into the vast majority of American households who presently own little, if any, of it? Attention should be given to new ways to distribute the benefits of this government-stimulated growth, despite all the fine populist oratory of great Americans, great men like Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and others. The distribution of wealth among Americans in relative terms is about the same today as it was when Herbert Hoover succeeded Calvin Coolidge as president. What's the matter with us? Why haven't we been doing something about that? Tax policy alone may not be adequate if expanded ownership is ever to become a reality. It seems to me that we'll have to do something on the monetary side as well, and I'm speaking there in terms of using the government's power through the Federal Reserve Bank and others to see to it that loans are made available on more reasonable terms to help workers acquire capital. Thus far, capital ownership in the United States has been concentrated to the point that about 95% of all corporate held stock is owned by about 15% of our people, and very little is held by anybody else. At the other end of the ownership spectrum, we find disturbing statistics provided by the National Bureau of Economic Research. According to your professor, Morton Feldstein, here at Harvard, for a majority of the American families, their most important wealth is their entitlements under the Social Security program. Now, you know what that amounts to? That means that their most important wealth is that the government has promised them that it will tax their children for their benefit. If we're trying to build something that we can be proud of, we ought to be working towards something where the parents will have something to leave their children, rather than simply continuing to make the rich richer. And I don't quarrel with that. If I had my way, they'd continue to be richer. I simply say that we ought to do better than that, and we ought to see that more people can share in this. I'm not against private property. I just want more people to own some. We have just passed the biggest tax cut in history, and yet it's going to tend to further concentrate our wealth in the hand of those who already have it. Shouldn't we instead be working to see to it that the increasing prosperity that we have in America spreads out and reaches people in all walks of life? By doing so, we will be fulfilling our promise of a better life for our people and challenging others in other nations to do likewise. Today, our political and economic system is challenged and threatened by military power, greater in numbers, stronger in discipline, superior in many of its arms. That hostile power views the mere existence of our freedom as a threat to its system. Hence, those who control that other system would like to destroy ours, from within if possible, or from without, if the price it has to pay in lives and treasure and resources is not too great. On the other hand, we hope to lead the world, including our adversaries, in our direction, and we hope to do it peacefully. To do so, we need a better working model of what we advocate. Naturally, we know that we have the best system. It provides personal freedom and a higher standard of living. But this should be our finest hour. We have not yet found a way to assure that every American has a reasonable job opportunity, and we ought to do that. Nor have we been able to assure that those who work have a fair share of what this nation has to offer, even at the end of the rainbow. So here's our challenge, and here's one of our very important responses to the challenge. We can show less developed, less sophisticated governments how to solve their problems by solving our own. What better answer can we offer to the unfulfilled promises of communism? The purpose of employee ownership is not to replace free enterprise, but to expand it. The goal is not to dismantle capitalism, but to fulfill its purpose. In years gone by, I've supported statehood bills, such as those for Alaska and for Hawaii. In those debates, as in previous statehood fights, we have heard the fears of the new states, or that the new states and the new voters would pose a threat to the Republic in one respect or another. In my research, I came across a statement by a previous senator more than 150 years ago. He said that the larger the number of hands into which we entrust the goddess liberty, the safer she would be. In that spirit, I say that the more Americans we bring into possession of a share of our productive capital, the safer our system, and indeed the better the whole free world will be. Thank you. Now, if there's someone who'd like to ask a question, so I'll do the best I can to respond. Yes, sir.
As you pointed out, the amount of employee pensions now amounts to billions of dollars.
I would guess maybe 80 billion or something like that.
The Supreme Court has ruled, I understand, that pensions are really part of the wage package and really belong to the employees. Those billions of dollars could be used to establish ownership or at least influence in the corporations in which they are invested. It would be very important in achieving the goals that you were speaking of. Obviously, there are legal problems. What do you see as the prospect of Congress removing some of the legal problems?
Well, you said there are legal problems, and many times people tell me, you know, you can't do that, it's against the law, and which you just respond, you know, that's my job to change the law, so that we definitely should remove the problems. In other words, one source of funds which ought to be used to help employees to borrow the money where they can, under very favorable tax circumstances, to acquire an equity position in their companies, is those very pension funds. And those funds are diversified, but there's no reason why they couldn't make loans and accept as collateral the stock that these employees are buying, which will pay for itself. You know, you can rent an automobile, or you can go in the business of renting an automobile. And I know some people who've done it as small business and also as big business. There's no way that they can compete with a privately owned automobile if a fellow can afford to buy that automobile. One simple reason: the guy that owns that automobile is going to take so much better care of it than he is the automobile he's renting from somebody else. The same thing tends to be true of the equipment. There's a very nice guy who's done some work for me around my farm at Baton Rouge. He's a retired employee from one of the oil companies, and I happened to notice around the place a nice flashlight. It had Exxon on the flashlight. Well, now, that just set me to thinking, if that fellow had been a major shareholder in that company, that flashlight would still be at the Exxon plant rather than around my farm. And the same thing is true about looking after your equipment and taking care of the parts of mining what you're putting together when you have an interest in it. Yes, sir.
If you were to ask us to put political support behind one current piece of legislation which you think is most important to improve the prospects of employee ownership for the future of America, what would that be?
Gee, I've got a package of about 6 of them out there, and I'm not sure just which one I'd put at the top of the list right now. Several people here have indicated some aspects of it that they'd like to go after, and I'm in considering the tax bill, we had about 15 provisions we'd like to put in the law that would move employee stock ownership ahead more rapidly. And the Secretary of Treasury and the President went along with us on about 7 of them. We'd had a lot more than that, except that they just felt that there was a high cost of government. One of those I'd want to put in there is to say that when you pay a dividend to employee stock ownership, it would not be taxable. It would be treated just the same as if it's wages. We could probably have that already, except it just costs money to the Treasury to do it. But at some point where we're going to raise money in some other respect, I think we can put it in. Yes, sir.
Senator Long, some economists would say that it's inflationary if the Federal Reserve discounted the loan paper of the employee trust for purposes of rebuilding the American enterprise system. If the company went to a bank and then borrowed, let's say you had a company that needed $500 million, in order for the employees to buy it out, expand it, and have to expand that plant. They went to their bank, the bank would go to the discount window of the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve would discount it, let's say, at the cost of the money, say 0.5% or 1%. Do you think that'd be inflation?
Well, I've got my doubts about discounted paper as low as 0.5% or 1%, but I am convinced that it's not inflationary to issue money if where that money is backed by something solid by way of security. I don't know whether you ever looked at it, but sometime you ought to take a look at your money and see what it said, what it reads on that. Have you ever done that? There was a time I can recall that, boy, you could get a piece of paper that had a little gold stamp on it. It meant that you could go redeem that thing in gold. Then later on they took the gold off, but they still had some of these silver certificates around that you could go to the mint and you could get some silver for your money. You just read what that thing says now. Have you ever read it lately? Listen to this. Federal Reserve note, the United States of America. This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. You can turn it in at the Treasury and get another piece of paper for it. If it's worn out, they'll give you a new piece of paper. But or you can use it to pay something you owe Uncle Sam, or you can use it to pay a debt, but they don't back it up with anything. I've many times thought that we ought to make the Federal Reserve discount paper to help employees buy stock in their companies, not at these high rates, because you and I know that a lot of that new money that goes into circulation, the government just prints it and puts it in circulation. And it's got the same thing on it, that they'll take it back for money you owe them. Okay, now, I would suggest that if it's backed by a loan to help employees own something on a $1 bill, instead of putting a picture of George Washington, we've got his picture all around anyhow, move him his picture and put a picture of a pair of pliers over there to represent the $1 that bought the pair of pliers. And if it's a $5 bill, put a Stilson wrench on there. This is what you bought with your money, and don't worry, if you want to redeem it, we'll give you a Stilson wrench for your $5 bill, so that you show that there is value to back it up, and that value is backed by a loan you made to somebody. So you call the loan in, and if you have to, and get the wrench. Yes, sir. Well, I am strongly for worker participation, and of course employee stock ownership tends to bring that about. When I believe that every company ought to make, in fact, most big companies, most of the very large companies do have employee ownership to a small extent, if only because of the investment tax credit we gave them for their companies, for employees, pardon me. They ought to mail a shareholders report that the ordinary worker and his wife can understand, telling how things are coming along with their investment or with their stock. I think that this employee ownership also, as you try to get employees to participate and take an interest, is going to be necessary to make the participation meaningful, because you can get employees to sit down and discuss their problems, but if they don't own any of it, then the question of whether the company makes more profits is not all that important. Yes, sir.
Senator, paying the interest on the national debt takes a lot of money from businesses, financing they need. Employee-owned businesses have some particular problems getting financing. With your support for employee-owned companies, what are you doing to reduce that?
Well, I've been meeting with what am I doing to reduce the deficit? Well, I've been meeting with a group, and I'm sort of pleased and honored in a way that I was invited to meet with the group of Democrats and Republicans, senators and congressmen, including some from down at the White House, trying to put together a package to reduce this federal deficit. And may I say that it's going to be a great deal larger than anything they've told you. I think that the first step to do something about it for the administration to tell us how big a deficit we're really in for, because it's about twice what they've been saying. But we're going to have to reduce spending wherever we can, and there are some places where we can do it, but we're also going to have to, in my judgment, do something about taxes. Now, I'll tell you as a Democrat, I say this as a Democrat because the Democrats have resolute on this. We discussed it in our caucus. We don't think we can afford that third stage tax cut. In other words, you're going to get a 10% cut in your income tax rates this year, individual rates, and you get another 10% next year. We don't think we can afford that third stage, that tax cut that would take place next year. If we call that one off, that'll save us $35 billion. And I think it'd be, if you've got to raise some more revenue, it'd be easier to do it that way than it would to do many of the other things that I've talked about. Yes, sir. What?
About the empowerment of ordinary workers through these laws. The vast majority of these laws, however, not pass through voting rights. Those that do, the majority of those don't pass through hourly employees. So you have a situation in which the advantages to the owners of those industries is clear. You have a way of raising capital, and they have a way of making money on taxes. The advantages to those workers who do not get voting rights is less than clear. They have ownership, but they don't have these votes. The point of view of trade unions complicates the situation, because the benefit they get from the profitability of the company tends to be a way in which they mortgage their power, their strike power, so to use their own interests. And I wonder whether you draw sharp distinctions between Utah with voting rights capture and those that the vast majority do not have the ability.
Let me tell you what my experience has been in that respect. It's been my experience that where you're talking about the large corporations, most of them do not object to passing the voting rights through to the employees. And as you know, under the tax credit that I helped to pass, the voting rights must be passed through to the employees. That's required in that event. Now, as you indicated, there are certain situations where the voting rights must be passed through. With regard to these smaller companies, a lot of them are afraid. They're fearful that they might lose control. They're fearful it might cause a split between the management, with labor votes siding with one brother against another brother in a closely held corporation and things of that sort. My honest belief is that when companies have had experience with employee ownership, they find that it creates a completely new attitude. And incidentally, I know of no case where employee ownership, either in whole or in part, has caused the people to get rid of their union. Even in those cases where the employees own 100% of the stock, they've still kept their unions. And in some cases, the unions have given management a very bad time in situations where the employees own 100% of it. So that, I mean, that, you know, fighting for what the rank and file employees believe. So that with time, these smaller companies will come to find that the workers are some of the best educated, most understanding shareholders that you can have anywhere. But that's going to take some time. And up to that time, I want the companies to be setting up the plans and putting the workers in for a piece of the action. And that being the case, I would rather not insist on voting rights until the management is willing to go along with it, and let it be discretionary with management for these smaller companies, because there are so many of them, and I honestly believe there's probably a majority of them who are just not going to put the plans in for fear that it might lead to voting control, or it might lead to some problem within management beyond their control. I honestly think that when you have it in there, they'll find that it works, that they get along with labor very well, and that labor is very wise and informed shareholders and make good decisions. When you really get down to it, who really ought to know whether you've got good management in the company better than the people who work there? Obviously, they ought to. But some people fear it in these smaller companies to get them to set the plans up. I'd resolve the difference. And incidentally, we've got an ESOP organization, people who work in this area all the time, and they resoluted that they also believe that these smaller held companies, that you ought to leave it up to the management, let them make their own decision. On the theory, it's more important to get the stock for the employees than it was that they voted. But I think in time, as sure as night follows day, management will see that it's to their advantage to let the employees vote that stock. Yes, sir. Well, it's hard to say. So far, the only real resistance, I mean, we've had to it in the Senate has been just that at the executive level, from the point of view of the administration, that's been the true whether you had a Republican administration or a Democratic administration. On behalf of the Treasurer, their view has been, well, if you want to do something that's going to cost the Treasury some money, cause us to collect less taxes, then we can't go along with very much of it, because if we do much more, and that's going to increase our deficit. That's the problem. But we haven't had much political resistance in that respect. We have had resistance over on the House side, just because we haven't had the kind of active leadership on behalf of this program on the House side. But if we can find a few members of the House who will take a very firm, active role in this thing, I just think we'll do a great deal more. There's very little resistance in the Senate, and I don't find any real dedicated resistance to it in the House. Thank you very much. Oh, I'll take one more question.
Senator, do you think that U.S. multinationals should advocate worker ownership abroad like it's there in Europe? And if so, what can we do to get them to follow the example of the
Well, the question is, should multinationals, U.S. multinational companies, advocate worker ownership abroad? I think they should. And what can we do to encourage them to do something about it? Well, at the moment, I don't know. That's the first, but I'd like to do it. Now, you've been working in that field. You give me some ideas, and I'll try to do something about it. Thank you very much.